Welcome back to LSAT Wizard's Homework Explanations. This is going to be a free explanation to June 2007's Reading Comprehension's fourth passage. This is the extension of our free logical reasoning and reading comprehension curriculum. And this is the homework explanations that are free as part of this program. Now, this COVID relief program that we're doing is a broader idea that we are trying to come together, or I came together with Ave Maria School of Law to offer free and low-cost LSAT prep. The COVID relief aspect of it is that we have a GoFundMe. So if you have found these lessons at all helpful, I do ask you guys to please seek out our GoFundMe and consider giving. We've already raised over $10,000. So I want to thank everybody who already has given, and thank you in advance to those who will. And then a special thank you to Ave Maria for helping put this all together, making sure that this happens. So with this, we're going to get into the June 2007 fourth passage here. And we're doing it in relation to the lesson 1 and lesson 2, specifically lesson 2, we talked about reading boot camp of this 7-step drill. If you have not already watched the previous lessons and you haven't watched the previous explanations, at this point, I advise you to, because I'm going to just jump right into it and save myself some time from having to explain it all again. So with that, I'm going to go right into this passage where I'm going to go through those notes that we take as part of step 2 of 7-step, which is our paragraph summaries and then an overall Q&A. So I summarize the first paragraph as identifying a problem in tracing the change, and I use quotes for when I'm literally quoting, tracing the changing face of Irish landscape, in that there's a limited amount of evidence for scholars to go off of. So it starts off that first sentence with what I quoted: in tracing the changing face of the Irish landscape, scholars have relied on this primary evidence of historical documents, and then they go into reasons where it's not reliable, it's scarce. Many of the relevant documents are very selective in what they cover. So they give us a few problems. And so that's why I say there's limitation to the evidence. Okay. So they're trying to understand something about Irish history and the Irish landscape, and the amount of evidence is limited. Now, second paragraph is presenting the studies of fossilized pollen grains preserved in peats and lake muds. And that is a subject matter. So if you talk about like extended parts, studies of fossilized pollen grains preserved in peats and lake muds is a subject matter, and they have the characteristic of providing an additional means of investigating vegetative landscape change. Basically, as I summarized, it's presenting the fossilized pollen grains as a way to, I use the quote, supplement or correct what the scholars originally thought. I get that second half here, the characteristic here of that last line at the end here, where analysis of samples, these type of samples, can identify which kinds of plants produce preserved pollen grains and when they were deposited, which in turn, in many cases, can serve to supplement or correct the documentary record. So that's going to be what we have as our issue there. Now, in terms of paragraph 3, for example, this is providing an example of one way in which it's supplemented or corrected. Specifically, it provided an example of the tilling in Longlow. I don't even know how to pronounce it, LL, and Longlow. And in terms of the original thought was that they didn't till this land until 7th century, a couple hundred years after 400 AD. Remember, 7th century would be like 600s. So the 600s, and specifically also when this Marlborough plow was invented. And they conclude, based on this type of study, that it actually occurred more around that 400 AD before that plow was invented. Then they go into paragraph 4 as another example. So it provides another example of how that study, how the type of study, this fossilized pollen grains of peat moss, et cetera, that extended subject matter. So that's why I keep referring to it as that type of study, how that corrected scholars' original thoughts about when flax was first grown in County Down. This is a different area. So instead of Longlow, this is about County Down. And specifically, the correction was that the flax was not cultivated prior to 18th century. So they talk about here how County Down was a great linen producer, and we know about the linen record, but we don't know about flax history, even though flax is used in the creation of linens. So while County Down is known as this like great linen producing area, we actually don't know about how long flax has been around. They say here, because of its prominence in terms of its great linen production, people thought that flax must have been there for, and we know flax has been there. They also say flax has been there in Ireland for a long time in general. So it had to have been in County Down, in the County Down area before 18th century, before they started producing the linen. And what they say is, but it indicates that's not the case. So in fact, it must have been before. Okay, so basically they only found deposits laid since the 18th century. So basically it's not before the 18th century. So that's the correction. So these are two examples, paragraph 3 and 4, of how this study could be used to supplement or correct the record. Now, paragraph 5 presents a limitation. It must be stressed, though, that there are limits. Specifically, that limitation that they're doing, they give an example such as, notice it's 4 examples. So it's not just specifically this is the only limitation. They just say, for example, this type of issue is inability to distinguish between different species from a same broader family, genus, etc. And they give an example of madder versus the goosegrass. And so they might not be able to tell the difference between cultivated and uncultivated. So they give a couple examples in terms of limitations, but the purpose of the paragraph is to point out limitations. Now, if I'm doing the broader Q&A, the question that they were trying to pose here, if I'm trying to put it into words, what was the question this passage was meant to answer? Well, how can studying fossilized pollen grains and again, that longer extended subject matter, preserved in peats and lake muds. So how can studying fossilized pollen grains preserved in peats and lake muds help us to understand things about the history of Ireland? I didn't want to use that quote again of tracing the face of Irish landscape. And I wasn't like, sure, when I say things, like obviously it's more about the landscape and the history of the landscape or whatever. So it's just things. I was generic. Don't be so hard on yourself. If you're not sure of a word, just use that word like things. And then the answer, and there is only one perspective here, it's just the author, he's saying that it can be used to supplement or correct, even though there is limitations. That's a nice synopsis of what's going on. Now, with that, we're going to go into explaining the questions. Now, the main point, remember, is that balance of our broad skill of reading with the narrow specific ability to pull out specific lines and look for specific logical issues like we focused on in lesson 1 of those pillars. Now, answer choice A is going to be our correct answer. In terms of generally this main point, it's going to be also from this overall Q&A synopsis. So how does it help us? It can supplement or correct, even if there's limitations. So analysis of fossilized pollen is a useful means of supplementing and sometimes even correcting other sources of information regarding changes in the Irish landscape. That's exactly what we were talking about. Now, the fact that it's not including the limitation, I would be like in my head, I wish it kind of did, because they did talk about that limitation, but is the absence of the limitation a problem for this answer? And the reason I'm going to say no is because it says that this is a useful means. They're not saying it's like the most useful or it's like overwhelmingly successful or anything. It's a useful means. So if there's limitations, that's congruent with the idea that it's useful. Okay, so going to the wrong answers. Analysis of the historical documents together with pollen evidence. And again, I like to say it in each video. I am going to read it so that I can give a stream of consciousness. Sometimes I read out loud, but it's easier for me to read in my head. And you could watch, am I going for my coffee or my water? That'll help you understand which way my mind's going right now. This one's my coffee. My Disney cup's the water. All right, so. So what this is saying, the main point is these changes, these specific changes are the main point. That the main point is that we've been able to change it rather than the broader idea that we can use pollen in general to help. And these are examples of and that's a little different of scope. So correct answer is basically saying that using this study of pollen is a way to supplement and correct, for example, these two things, as opposed to B is saying the main point is that we absolutely have been able to correct it. Okay, rather than the more broad idea that it's useful in helping us supplement and correct. So that's where B is close, but not correct. C. So analysis of fossilized pollen has proven to be a valuable tool. If it said in supplementing and correcting the record, I'd be okay with that. Identification of ancient plant species, though, that's like something it does in relation to helping us supplement and correct the record. But the point isn't that it IDs plants. It's what those plants then tell us about the broader history. So that's where C is incorrect. So this is also very narrow in the sense that it's saying that the main point is that the pollen has shown us specifically that these crops had a significant impact. Now, first off, I'm going to say the main point was not about those examples. Those are examples of a broader point rather than those examples being the main point. On top of that, what D is saying is just that those examples it's highlighting that they had significant impact when the point was that we actually had to correct the record. We already knew maybe that it was important. The question was, like with flax, what was the timing of it? So this is kind of just throwing words from the passage into this answer. But because it's saying that they had a significant impact, that's not the point here. We're not trying to say that it's an impact. We're talking about changing what we previously thought about it, not from no impact to yes impact, but it was this date versus that date. That was kind of the point of what we were doing. And again, those were just examples, the broader message that we can use this technique to help us out. So E is bringing in the limitation, but is actually phrasing it that the limitation is the main point. So when you say, while it is true that X, it is also true that I have Y, that's like phrasing we need to know structurally from LR. The main conclusion is not X. The main conclusion is actually Y. While it's true that I have X, it is also true that I have Y. The main conclusion would have to be Y. And so when we have this, while pollen evidence can sometimes supplement, so that being not really the main point really being that its applicability is severely limited. Okay, so that being the main point. The main point is that it's limited. No, I think the limitation is a commentary of how useful it could be. It's like a hesitation on how useful it could be, but it's not actually the main point that it's limited. The main point is that it's helpful, albeit with some sort of limitation. Okay, so that's going to be why E is incorrect. Moving forward. 24. Passage indicates that pollen analysis have provided evidence against which of the following views. Okay, so we need evidence against. You had to catch that against. I'm sure people missed that idea. So they want evidence for, and if you pick that, then if you read it as just provided evidence for, you're going to get this question wrong. So you got to be able to read every word and see that we're looking for something that it's against. We look at the right answer. In certain parts of County Down, cereal grains were not cultivated to any significant extent before the 7th century. Okay. Now, this is where, let's go back to this. County Down. Okay. And when we're talking about here, and I realize maybe I'm even realizing as I'm reading it, I had marked the answers. I had read it. I really do this stream of consciousness. This is you guys catching me live as I'm doing this. I just kind of looked up the answers and I marked them so that I could be able to explain it. But I'm going to go through this because I'm right now, it's not fully clicking in my head. It's total stream of consciousness of what's going on right now. Getting to see me work my way through. Let me get to the answer myself, be able to explain it then afterwards. So I'm sorry, it is correct. And I really apologize that that just happened to me. It's funny, I just went to the down, and I'll talk about exactly what happened. And this is the kind of mistakes that you guys probably are going to make too. This is where getting to the end of the day, I've been recording videos a lot and it's not fully clicking, but counting down, I was saying, oh, that only was the third paragraph. That was the third, I'm sorry, the second example, the fourth paragraph, second example. And I totally forgot that it was talking about this, because as I was reading this, I was like, wait, counting down and seventh century was that first example, when counting down was that second example, when didn't fully click in my head that long low is in counting down. So as soon as I see that, now I'm able to justify that B is going to be the correct answer, which was exactly literally just what I said the purpose of that first example was that it was before 7th century. Just realizing that counting down and cereal grains were cultivated before the 7th century. That's what they were able to find. This is literally just that paragraph. So apologies for the stumble there, but that's where the correct answer is going to come from. Now, as I went through this, I was able to do process of elimination as well, because I was like, the Marlboro plow was introduced in the 7th century. That's explicitly what they said. What they were changing is whether there was tilling before the millboard plow, but the moldboard plow. But the idea was that there was tilling beforehand, sure, but the plow did come about in the 7th century. They never corrected that. So A was something that was backed up, and so it's not against. C, in certain parts of Ireland, cereal grain had been cultivated continuously since the introduction of that. This was something that we've accepted from the start. When exactly they started tilling again, and same explanation for A, sure, but it's accepted. So C is something that's accepted, so not against. D, cereal grain requires tilling. That's actually something they rely on in reaching the conclusion that it was earlier than 7th century that the tilling was happening. So D is something the author explicitly states and accepts. Cereal grain began around 400. Now, I want to be clear here. E would actually be something I'm not sure we could validly conclude because it's saying it definitely began around 400. Now, we don't know for sure that the cereal grain began exactly in 400. We know that it was earlier than we originally thought, which originally we thought it was 700. Now we're knowing that it's early, or the 7th century, 600s. Now we know it's earlier in the 400s, but we don't know for a fact that it was a 400. So if this said cereal grain cultivation began in county at least, or at latest by 400, that would be something we could validly infer. We cannot validly infer E. Now, regardless of all of that, it's definitely wrong for this question because we're trying to figure out something that's against it. So I was trying to give that other angle of what if it was a support answer. We actually can't say it because of the exact extent of E. I want you to notice that. But regardless, it's definitely not something that's against it. So apologies again for that stumble with B, but that is the correct answer. All right, 25. The phrase documentary record, when they reference that, I'm going to read around it and go back to that line. Analysis of samples. So this is kind of that history of what they were, this unreliable accounts that they talk about, the reliable accounts in the first paragraph being scarce and the documentary sources. So those are the history that they were relying on, the documents from the 16th century, the 17th century, from matters relating to military, commercial interests. These things in the first paragraph, the fragmentary record, that's what they are talking about when they say the documentary record. So the correct answer, government and commercial records, maps, and similar documents produced in the past that recorded conditions and events at that time. That would be related to the commercial interests, for example, or the military interests, government military type interests. So those would be examples of those selective documents that we wanted. Now, if we look at the other ones and do process of elimination here, okay, the documentary record wasn't the pollen itself. The pollen is going to supplement the documents, okay? So that's where A is incorrect. Same exact reason as B. The documentary record was not about the pollen. The pollen is going to supplement the documentary record. So the idea of C is that it's about current historians, where they were talking about scholars relying on primarily evidence, relied primarily on evidence from historical documents. So this documentary record is historical documents, not current historians trying to describe the past. That would not be a historical document. So that's why C is incorrect. Same exact explanation of E. And so we're going to get D and move on. All right. So 26. Okay, so prior to the passage, prior to the use of pollen, at least some historians believe which are the following. This has to be one of our two things. Before I even look at what the right answer is, okay, what we had, it has to be one of those two examples. It has to be either the example where we thought tilling was 600s, but it really was 400s, or where flax was actually not cultivated, even though they previously thought the cultivated. So when they're asking, what did they previously believe? Let's say, so it was tilling didn't occur until the 7th century, or that flax was cultivated prior to 8th century in County Down. So the beginning of flax cultivation in County Down may well have occurred before the 18th century. That's exactly that second one. So that's going to be the correct answer right there. All right, let's go through the other ones. The Irish landscape had experienced significant flooding. Flooding is not something I remember reading at all, so especially not of specific dates. So this could be tricky for people because it's not that cereal grain was not cultivated anywhere in Ireland. The idea was from that first example that cereal cultivation didn't occur in this area, okay, because this soil, where was it here? The substantial clay content of the soil in this part of Down made cultivation difficult with primitive tools. Okay, so and so it's only in reference of this area because of this clay content. So we can't say anywhere in Ireland. Okay, we don't know. They only thought that this area waited until the 7th century when they had the right plow for this type of area. So that's why B would be incorrect. The author disagrees with this idea, but that doesn't mean that historians think it's good. The author says, hey, the record was faulty, was limited, was scarce. But that doesn't mean that historians think it was a good record. Maybe they agree with the author. They're like, look, we did the best we could in finding things, but this is all we got. So we don't know that historians agree or disagree with C. Matter. Now, something that I'm realizing matter with this, the MADDER matter. Matter was only brought up. And remember also just a quick little note, just to confirm if I'm looking exactly where it is, you can do, if you're doing the flex version of the test, you can do the Control F or Command F search function. And I could be like, where did they talk about matter? Matter was only talked about in that last paragraph in terms of the limitation. And that's not anything in terms of the historian's beliefs. Okay, so that's where we get that perspective difference. So the authors, the historians didn't really comment on matter at all. Definitely not when they're talking about the 18th century, that was only about flax, not about matter. So that is where 26 would be E. All right, 27. Which most accurately describes the relationship between the second and final? Well, let's go back to my initial analysis here. Paragraph 2, it presents studying fossilized pollen grains as a way to supplement or correct. And paragraph 5 is, the last paragraph is presenting the limitation on it. So let's see. The final paragraph qualifies the claim made in the second paragraph. Now, I've talked a lot in these explanation videos with reading about how vocabulary is not really put to the test on this test. You want to read around vocabulary words. However, there are times that the LSAT requires you to have a level of understanding of vocabulary. They do expect you to have at least here. Words that are up here, you don't generally need to know. How do we know whether it's a word we need to know or not? Well, this is my thought. Any word you don't know. So if you're thinking qualifies, and I'm not sure exactly what they mean here, the idea is put it on a list of words that you didn't know. If that word shows up more than once, then go memorize it. I've said that before in this curriculum. Now, in terms of this is one word, though, that I'm going to emphasize. I've seen used multiple times, and consistently students misunderstand the word. When I say misunderstand, people see qualifies and they think of like qualifications like qualifying for the Olympics or qualified to be a doctor. And so they're thinking about the qualifications of having certain lofty credentials. What's really interesting about this word qualifies is that it actually has a secondary meaning that almost is, in a way, a little bit counter to that first thought. qualifies in terms of use in reference of an argument or of a position. If you're going to qualify an argument, if you're going to qualify a position, what it actually is to put a limitation or a hesitation on it. If you don't believe me, literally Google the definition of qualifies, look for that second, third, fourth definition. It is a definition of qualifies. To qualify an argument or to qualify a position is to put hesitations on it. It's not to back it up and support it. It's actually to put that hesitation. So this is an example where you did need to know that definition. And if you do know that definition, C should stand out, especially based on how I broke it down. So that's going to be C. Let's just look at the others. Second paragraph, propose a hypothesis. Okay, I don't really love the idea of hypothesis. I think it was presenting this study method, but maybe you could call that hypothesis. And then the final paragraph offers supporting examples. No. The two paragraphs after it provided examples, but definitely not the final paragraph. The final paragraph was the hesitation and limitations. The final paragraph describes a problem that must be solved before the one from the second paragraph can be viable. And that's that's too strong of a degree of this limitation. They're not saying the limitation prevents it from being useful. In fact, they've already said how useful it could be in the two middle paragraphs there of the examples. It's really useful in these circumstances. It's just not always useful. That's very different than what B is saying, which is saying it can't possibly be useful until we solve this problem of the final paragraph. And that makes that wrong. Second paragraph describes a view against which the author intends to argue. So the author's arguing against a view in the second paragraph is giving that, and this is already going counter to what that second paragraph was. The author's presenting his belief in the second paragraph. So it's not anything the author's against. So that is D out. Final paragraph offers procedures to supplement the method of that. This is, again, similar to the one earlier of supporting it. This is almost suggesting that the final paragraph is support for it rather than that limitation for it. So that's where E is out. So again, definitely understand if you didn't know that definition of qualifies, hopefully now you do, because they have used that, not a ton, but they've used it multiple times. So get to know that qualifies in reference of an argument means putting a hesitation or a limitation on that argument. And so that is the correct answer. So that's going to be the explanations to this June 2007 reading. If you want to check out the other homework, realize that we do have a lot more homework explanation, hours and dozens of hours of homework explanation on LSATwizard.com. Go to video courses and check it out. Reach out to me if you have any questions. As always, you can find me on YouTube, Reddit, Facebook. Email me, LSATwizard.com. I'm around. I was on the phone with some students today. I email with you guys. Thank you all for the kind messages. And I will catch you guys all in lesson 3. Have a good one.